Why would a surgeon's scalpel forged in the brilliant light of the Roman Empire be found centuries later nestled in silk within a golden reliquary, venerated not as a tool of healing, but as an instrument of a saint's martyrdom? How did a single, poorly translated Greek treatise, a whisper of flawed genius from the ancient world, condemn millions of human beings to a slow, methodical death by bleeding for more than 1,000 years? These are not riddles. They are receipts. They are the bloody invoices left behind by an age when the act of healing was a terrifying crossroads where faith, forgotten science, and whispered magic met in a deadly collision. An era when the cure was often a curse in disguise. The story begins not with a discovery, but with a great forgetting. It begins with the shattering of an empire. When Rome fell, it did not fall alone. It dragged down with it a world of knowledge. Aqueducts that had carried clean water for millions crumbled into ditches of filth. Libraries that held the accumulated wisdom of Hippocrates, of Celsus, of Galen were put to the torch, their scrolls turning to black, fluttering ash on the wind. The precise, elegant art of Roman surgery, which could set complex fractures, remove cataracts, and even perform rudimentary brain operations, vanished as if it were a dream upon waking. In the ensuing silence, in the creeping twilight of the Dark Ages, the custodianship of knowledge, and therefore of medicine, fell to the only institution left standing, the Church. Healing retreated from the bustling forum and the military field hospital, taking refuge behind the thick, cold stone walls of monasteries. Here, in the quiet scriptoriums, the last embers of ancient medicine were tended, but they were tended by hands that served God first and man second. The monk-physician was a new breed of healer. His primary concern was not the ailing body, but the stained soul within it. Sickness, in this new world order, was no longer a biological malfunction. It was a divine judgment, a punishment for sin, a trial sent by God to test one's faith, or worse, a direct assault by the legions of hell, a demonic infestation in the flesh. This single, devastating idea changed everything. It transformed the practice of medicine from a science, however imperfect, into a theological drama. The physician's tools were no longer the scalpel and the suture, but the prayer book and the relic. The infirmary became less a place of treatment and more a way station to the afterlife. The goal was not necessarily to cure the body, but to save the soul from the affliction that held it captive. A patient's recovery was a miracle, a sign of divine favor. Their death was simply the righteous and expected outcome of their sinfulness. Imagine a monastery perched on a windswept hill, its stone walls a fortress against the chaos of the world. Inside, in a long, draughty hall, lie the sick. The air is thick with the scent of incense, damp straw, and the sweet, cloying smell of decay. A monk moves between the cots, his face etched with a mixture of piety and weary resignation. He does not take a pulse. He does not examine a wound with a practiced eye. Instead, he holds aloft a splinter of wood, allegedly from the true cross, and presses it to a man's feverish brow, murmuring prayers for deliverance. He offers a foul-tasting herbal concoction, brewed not according to its chemical properties, but because the plant's leaves were shaped like a liver, and thus, by the doctrine of signatures, was believed to be God's own sign that it would cure a liver ailment. The monks did preserve some ancient texts, copying them laboriously by candlelight, but they were not neutral scribes, they were censors. They were editors for God. They scraped away the pagan wisdom of the ancients with pumice stones, editing the works of Galen and Hippocrates to align with Christian dogma. Any observation that contradicted Scripture was deemed a dangerous falsehood. The intricate study of anatomy, the very foundation of surgery, was forbidden. To dissect a human body, a temple made in God's own image, was a profound act of sacrilege. How could one heal a machine one was forbidden to understand? The result was a medical system built on a foundation of faith, fear, and profound ignorance. Epidemics swept through the burgeoning towns of Europe like wildfire, and the official response was not quarantine, but mass prayer. Processions of the faithful would march through the streets, flagellating themselves, begging for God's mercy, all the while breathing the same infected air, ensuring the pestilence would claim even more victims. Leprosy, a terrifying but not exceptionally contagious disease, became the ultimate symbol of sin made manifest. Lepers were declared legally dead, forced to attend their own funerals before being cast out of society, condemned to wander the earth ringing a bell to warn the clean of their approach. Their affliction was seen as a visible sign of an impure soul, and their isolation was not a public health measure but a spiritual quarantine. Could you live in a world where a cough could be interpreted as a sign of God's wrath, and the only prescription was penance? It was an age of terrible certainty where the answers to the most complex medical questions were simple, absolute, and almost always wrong. The medieval doctor treated not the body but the sinful soul, yet somehow always billed for the body. The great irony is that within these same monastery walls a quiet, methodical science did flourish: botany. The monks became master gardeners, cultivating vast and intricate herb gardens, the hortulus. They meticulously catalogued hundreds of plants, noting their uses for everything from soothing a cough to dressing a wound. This was permissible knowledge, as God had surely placed these remedies upon the earth for man to use. Yet even this botanical wisdom was filtered through a lens of theology and superstition. The effectiveness of a plant might be tied to the phase of the moon under which it was harvested, or the specific prayer recited as it was ground into a poultice. This fragile, sanctioned knowledge was a pale shadow of the pharmacological expertise of the Roman world, a flickering candle in a vast and encroaching darkness. And it was a candle that cast long, dangerous shadows, for the Church's monopoly on healing was absolute. To seek a cure outside its authority was to traffic with the devil. But what happened when prayer failed? What happened when the relics remained inert and the holy water could not cool a raging fever? Mankind's desperation for a cure did not vanish with the Roman Empire. It festered, it sought other answers, whispered in hushed tones, away from the watchful eyes of the priests. The suffering body demanded a logic, a system, something more tangible than a prayer. It was this desperation that led physicians to cling with religious fervor to the last great scientific theory of the ancient world, a theory that was elegant, comprehensive, and catastrophically wrong. The true enemy, they decided, was not the disease but a fundamental imbalance of the four vital fluids coursing through every man, woman, and child. If you were transported to that time, facing a life-threatening illness, what would you choose? A splinter from a saint's bone, offered with a prayer and the promise of salvation, or the cold, forbidden memory of a surgeon's scalpel, a tool from a world that believed in healing the flesh, not just cleansing the soul? Tell us in the comments. Would you trust in faith, or would you long for steel? This imbalance of the four vital fluids, the cornerstone of a medical system that would dominate the Western world for well over 1,000 years, was a ghost of ancient Greece, a legacy of the brilliant but fallible physician named Galen of Pergamon. His theory of humorism was a masterpiece of intellectual symmetry. The human body, he proposed, was a microcosm of the universe, governed by the same four elements: earth, air, fire, and water. Within the body, these elements were represented by four fluids or humours: blood, associated with air, phlegm with water, yellow bile with fire, and black bile with earth. Each humour possessed its own qualities. Blood was hot and moist, phlegm was cold and moist, yellow bile was hot and dry, black bile was cold and dry. A healthy person was one in whom these four humours existed in perfect, harmonious balance. Sickness, therefore, was never caused by an external agent, a germ, a contagion. Sickness was, in every single case, the result of a surplus or a deficiency of one of these humours. A fever was an excess of blood, a cough was a surfeit of phlegm, a fit of rage was a surge of yellow bile. A deep melancholy was the sluggish pooling of black bile. The logic was seductive, a grand unified theory of human health. It explained everything from a common cold to the deepest despair. And if the diagnosis was so simple, then surely the cure must be just as straightforward. To restore health, one simply had to restore the balance. One had to remove the excess humor. This principle, so elegant in theory, unleashed upon the world the most enduring, widespread, and bloody medical practice in human history: bloodletting. The lancet, a small, sharp, often ornate blade, became the single most important tool in the physician's arsenal. It was more trusted than any herbal remedy, more immediate than any prayer. The logic was brutal and direct. If a man was feverish, flushed, and agitated, he clearly had too much blood. The solution? Open a vein and let the excess, the very substance of the sickness, drain away. The practice became a universal panacea. Headaches, apoplexy, pneumonia, indigestion, mania, even a broken bone. The first and most common prescription was phlebotomy. Physicians developed intricate charts mapping the veins of the body and linking them to specific organs and ailments. To cure a pain in the liver, one must bleed a vein in the right arm. For a headache, the temporal artery. For a toothache, a vein beneath the tongue. The alignment of the stars and planets was also deemed crucial. A physician would consult an astrological calendar before making an incision, as bleeding a patient under the wrong zodiacal sign could have disastrous, even fatal, consequences. Could you entrust your life to a man who believed more in the position of Mars than in the beating of your own heart? The act of bloodletting was a ritual, a piece of medical theatre. The physician, a university-trained man who spoke Latin and rarely touched his patients, would make the diagnosis. But the bloody work itself was often beneath him. It was delegated to a lower class of practitioner, the barber surgeon. In towns and villages across Europe, the barber's shop, with its iconic red and white striped pole symbolizing blood and bandages, was the local clinic. Here, amidst the snipping of hair and the scraping of beards, men and women would come to be bled. Imagine the scene, a bustling marketplace, the air filled with the cries of merchants and the smell of livestock. A man sits on a stool, his sleeve rolled up, his arm extended over a brass bowl. The barber surgeon, his apron already stained with the day's work, makes a swift, practiced cut. The blood, dark and shockingly vibrant, streams into the bowl. The patient grows pale, his head swims, he faints. This was not considered a side effect. It was a sign of success. The swoon indicated that the corrupting excess humor had been purged and balance was being restored. Leeches, the writhing black denizens of stagnant ponds, became another popular tool in this war on bodily fluids. The leech wife would collect them, and physicians would apply them to areas too delicate for the lancet: the gums, the nostrils, the eyelids. Cupping was another variation on the theme. A glass cup would be heated and placed on the skin. As it cooled, the vacuum created would draw the skin upward, and the blood, it was believed, would be drawn from the deeper tissues. Sometimes this dry cupping was followed by wet cupping, where the raised skin would be nicked with a blade before the cup was applied, causing blood to pool dramatically within the glass. But the assault on the body's humors was not limited to the veins. A patient could be purged from every orifice, a surplus of phlegm. The prescription was an expectorant, something to make you cough violently. An excess of yellow or black bile? The answer was a powerful emetic to induce vomiting, or a caustic purgative to violently empty the bowels. Patients were subjected to a relentless barrage of procedures that left them dehydrated, weakened, and profoundly anemic, making them far more vulnerable to the very disease the treatment was intended to cure. What is more terrifying, the disease that kills you or the treatment that does the same, but slower and more painfully? This was not a system born of malice. It was a system born of a desperate need for answers in a world of overwhelming suffering, built upon a foundation of flawed but authoritative ancient wisdom. Galen's writings were treated not as scientific hypotheses to be tested, but as infallible gospel. For a medieval physician to question Galen was as unthinkable as for a priest to question the Bible. For centuries, generation after generation of healers would look at a patient dying of a wasting disease and, seeing their pale skin and weak pulse, conclude that the last dregs of their bad blood must be removed. They would open a vein and watch as the last of the patient's life force ebbed away, convinced they had done everything in their power to save them. The dominion of blood was absolute. It was a tyranny built on a single bad idea, a tyranny that held life and death in its grip. But while the physicians and barbers were busy spilling the red river of life, another, quieter form of medicine was being practiced, a healing art rooted not in the body's fluids, but in the green and growing things of the earth itself. It was a medicine of leaf and root, of flower and bark, a knowledge that flourished in two very different kinds of gardens, the orderly, sanctified garden of God and the wild, untamable thicket of the witch. The battle for the human body was not fought only with lancets and leeches, it was also fought in the soil, over the right to pick a leaf, to grind a root, to mix a potion. This was the war over phytotherapy, the medicine of plants, and it pitted two powerful opposing worlds against each other. On one side stood the monastery with its meticulously planned hortulus, the apothecary's garden. Here, within the safety of sacred walls, botany was elevated to a divine science. Each plant was a gift from God, a living symbol of His grace, placed on earth for the benefit of mankind. Monks, the intellectual heirs of the Roman naturalists, became Europe's foremost botanists. They collected, cultivated, and catalogued hundreds of species, from the humble chamomile to the potent poppy. Their work was one of order, of classification, of bringing God's wild creation under man's disciplined hand. They created vast herbals, magnificent illuminated manuscripts filled with detailed drawings of plants and their medicinal uses. These were not just practical guides, they were theological texts, celebrating the divine harmony of the natural world. In the monastery's apothecary, the air was filled with the scent of drying herbs. Here, the monk physician would compound complex remedies, grinding seeds in a mortar, infusing oils, distilling waters. His was a rational herbalism based on the texts of antiquity, Dioscorides, Pliny, and of course, the ever-present Galen. The remedies were designed to counteract the humoral imbalance. A hot disease, like a fever, would be treated with a cold herb, like willow bark. A cold ailment, like a cough, would be treated with a hot spice, like ginger. This was a system of logic, of balance, of sanctioned, controllable knowledge. But beyond the monastery walls in the villages and forests, a different kind of botanical knowledge thrived. This was the intuitive, ancestral medicine of the common people, a wisdom passed down not through books but from mother to daughter, from healer to apprentice, through generations of trial and error. These were the folk healers, the cunning women, the herbalists and the midwives. Their laboratory was the untamed wilderness, their knowledge rooted in a deep, practical understanding of the local flora. They knew which mushrooms could stop a hemorrhage, which berries could soothe a teething baby, which leaves, when chewed, could dull the agony of a toothache. Their medicine was often far more effective than the complex, theory-laden concoctions of the monks. They understood dosages, the synergistic effects of plant combinations, and the dangerous, twofold nature of a plant that could either heal or kill. But their knowledge was inextricably woven with the threads of the old world, the pagan world. Their remedies were often accompanied by incantations whispered under a full moon, by charms and rituals that predated the arrival of the cross. This fusion of practical pharmacology and ancient magic made them powerful. It also made them dangerous. The Church, which sought a total monopoly on all forms of healing, spiritual and physical, could not tolerate such unregulated power. The village herbalist who successfully treated a sick child with a poultice was a direct competitor to the priest who offered prayers for the same purpose. Her success was an implicit challenge to the idea that healing came only from God. Thus, the line between a life-saving decoction and a witch's poisonous brew became dangerously, deliberately blurred. The same plant could be either a holy remedy or a diabolical ingredient, depending entirely on whose hands prepared it. A poppy-based syrup, when mixed by a monk in a monastery, was a blessed anodyne, a gift from God to ease suffering. But that same syrup, when brewed by a woman in a forest hut to ease the pain of childbirth, could be condemned as a devil's trick, an illusion designed to tempt the soul and interfere with the righteous, God-ordained suffering of Eve's curse. The witch hunt that would sweep across Europe in the later Middle Ages was not just a product of religious hysteria, it was also a brutal campaign to medicalize and monopolize healing, to stamp out the competition. The inquisitor who put an herbalist to the question was not just hunting for a servant of Satan, he was often eliminating a rival healthcare provider. Imagine a village midwife, her hands skilled from delivering hundreds of babies, her knowledge of herbs able to stanch bleeding and ease labor pains. Now imagine a university-trained physician arriving in that village, his head full of Latin texts but with no practical experience in childbirth. The midwife is his natural rival. How does he eliminate her? He accuses her of witchcraft. Her knowledge of abortifacient herbs becomes proof she makes pacts with demons. Her soothing lullabies become incantations. Her success becomes evidence of supernatural aid. The witch's cauldron, bubbling with its infamous brew of eye of newt and toe of frog, was a powerful piece of propaganda. It transformed the folk healer's stockpot, filled with beneficial herbs, into an object of terror. This war for control over nature's pharmacy had devastating consequences. It drove a vast store of practical, effective medical knowledge underground, or stamped it out entirely. It created a climate of fear and suspicion, where a woman could be burned at the stake for knowing which plants grew in her own backyard. It reinforced the idea that the female body and female knowledge was inherently suspect, a vessel for sin and corruption. The quiet, orderly monastery garden and the wild, unpredictable forest represented the two poles of medieval medicine, one sanctioned, theoretical, and often ineffective, the other practical, effective, and lethally dangerous to practice. It was a classic medieval bargain. You could have a safe cure that did not work, or a working cure that could get you killed. Yet this entire complex, brutal struggle, the theological medicine of the monks, the humoral butchery of the physicians, the forbidden magic of the herbalists, was about to be judged. It was about to face a foe against which all its theories, all its prayers, and all its potions would prove utterly, horrifyingly useless. An enemy was coming from the east, a foe carried on the backs of rats and the breath of men, an enemy that would not distinguish between priest and pagan, between the learned doctor and the village witch. It was a pestilence so vast and so virulent that it would be seen by many not as a disease, but as the apocalypse itself. The Black Death was coming, and it was about to expose the magnificent, blood-soaked fraud that was medieval medicine. The year is 1347. A fleet of 12 Genoese trading galleys returning from the Black Sea limps into the Sicilian port of Messina. The townspeople who gather at the docks to greet them are met with a horrifying sight. Most of the sailors aboard the ships are dead, and those who are still alive are gravely ill, covered in mysterious black boils that ooze blood and pus, their bodies racked with fever and pain. The Sicilian authorities, in a panic, order the death ships out of the harbour. But it is too late. The plague is already ashore. Within 5 years, it will kill more than a third of the entire population of Europe, perhaps as many as 50 million people. The Black Death was the final, unanswerable indictment of the entire medieval worldview. Before this unrelenting onslaught, every pillar of society, faith, science, and magic crumbled into dust. All the established certainties were washed away in a tide of death. The Church's explanation was swift and predictable. The plague was the wrath of God, a divine scourge sent to punish a sinful world. The response was prayer, fasting, and mass religious processions. But these acts of piety became horrifyingly counterproductive. Crowds of people huddled together in churches to pray for deliverance, creating the perfect conditions for the pneumonic form of the plague to spread through the air. In a single parish in England, the priest had to be replaced 8 times in a single year. God, it seemed, was not listening. Or worse, he was actively hostile, for many, faith shattered. If the righteous and the wicked, the infant and the elder, the priest and the thief were all struck down with equal indifference, what was the meaning of a moral life? The medical community, with its dogmatic adherence to Galen's humoral theory, was equally catastrophically helpless. They diagnosed the plague as a corruption of the humours caused by a miasma, a poisonous vapour that had emanated from earthquakes or the unfortunate alignment of the planets. The famous medical faculty at the University of Paris produced a report blaming a triple conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter and Mars in the sign of Aquarius. Armed with this useless diagnosis, their treatments were predictable and deadly. They bled patients who were already dying of septicemic shock, further weakening them. They lanced the buboes, the swollen lymph nodes in the armpits and groin that gave the bubonic plague its name, which only helped to spread the bacterial infection. They prescribed powerful purgatives and emetics, hastening death from dehydration. What hope did a patient have when their doctor's best advice was to avoid bathing, as open pores might allow the evil miasma to enter the body? The most iconic figure of the plague doctor, is a testament to this era's profound misunderstanding of disease. Clad head to toe in waxed leather with a terrifying beaked mask, he was a figure of dread. The beak was not for intimidation, it was a primitive respirator stuffed with aromatic herbs like mint, cloves and camphor, meant to purify the foul air and ward off the miasma. But these doctors often did more harm than good, carrying the pestilence on their clothing and instruments from one patient to the next. Folk remedies and magic were no more effective. Amulets were worn, inscribed with magical words and symbols. People carried sweet-smelling flowers and pomanders, hoping to overpower the deadly miasma. Some of the prescribed cures descended into sheer insanity. People were advised to inhale the fumes from public latrines, believing that one foul smell would drive out another. One of the most bizarre remedies involved the vicary method, where the still warm body of a pigeon or a chicken would be cut in half and applied to the plague buboes in the belief that the bird would draw the venom of the plague out of the sufferer. When all else failed, society turned on itself, desperate for a scapegoat. A wave of violent hysteria swept the continent. Groups of flagellants emerged, wandering from town to town, whipping themselves into a bloody frenzy in public displays of penance, hoping their self-inflicted suffering would appease an angry God. Their processions, however, only served as another vector for spreading the disease. The most tragic victims of this paranoia were the Jewish communities. A vicious rumor spread that the plague was a conspiracy, that Jewish people were poisoning the wells of Christendom. Despite the fact that the plague was killing Jews at the same rate as Christians, and despite papal bulls condemning the violence, pogroms erupted across Europe. Entire communities were burned alive, their property seized, their existence erased. The Black Death was the great equalizer. It killed the rich in their castles and the poor in their hovels. It struck down the learned physician who quoted Galen and the village herbalist who trusted in charms. It proved with terrifying finality that for all its intricate theology, its complex pseudoscience, and its deep-rooted superstitions, medieval Europe knew absolutely nothing about the true nature of disease. The world that emerged from the plague was a changed one. The massive loss of life led to profound social and economic shifts. Labor became scarce, empowering the surviving peasantry. The authority of the church was severely weakened, and for medicine, the plague was a moment of profound, painful humiliation. The utter failure of the Galenic model, while not immediately abandoned, was now glaringly apparent. It planted a seed of doubt, a desperate need for new answers, for a medicine based not on ancient texts and astrological charts, but on direct observation of the suffering human body. The road to that new knowledge would be long, and it would lead through even greater spectacles of pain. For if the physicians could not cure you, there was another class of practitioner who could certainly cut the disease out. Their theatre was not the lecture hall, but the bloody stage of the operating room. You are a plague doctor in a dying city. All official remedies have failed. A desperate charlatan offers you two final options for your patients. One is a poultice made from dried toads and prayer scrolls. The other is a potion of mercury and ground-up unicorn horn. Both are madness, but you must choose. What do you administer? Let us know, the pious toad or the exotic horn. In an age before anesthesia, surgery was not a healing art. It was a form of controlled, desperate torture. It was a spectacle of pain, a brutal race against time where the patient's screams were the soundtrack to the surgeon's work. The line between the surgeon, the butcher, and the executioner was perilously thin. In the rigid hierarchy of medieval medicine, the physician was the aristocrat. He was university-educated, read Latin, and concerned himself with the noble, internal art of balancing humours. He rarely, if ever, deigned to touch a patient. Surgery, on the other hand, was a manual craft, a trade for barbers and tinkers. It was the messy, bloody, low-status work of the hands, not the mind. Operations, when they were performed, were often public affairs, conducted in open-air theatres or on market squares, with a paying audience eager for the grisly entertainment. The surgeon's primary virtues were not delicacy or knowledge, but speed and brute strength. A good surgeon was a fast surgeon. An amputation that took more than a minute was a failure, as the patient was likely to die of shock from the prolonged agony. Imagine the scene. A man with a gangrenous leg is strapped to a wooden table. Strong assistants, often just burly blacksmiths or fellow barbers, hold him down, their weight pinning his flailing limbs. There is no anesthetic, no sterile field, no understanding of germs. The patient is given a leather strap to bite down on, or a swig of crude alcohol to dull his senses, but nothing can prepare him for what is to come. The barber surgeon approaches, his apron already stiff with the dried blood of previous procedures. His tools are laid out, a large curved amputation knife, a bone saw, and a brazier heating an iron to a cherry-red glow. He works with a grim, focused intensity. The knife cuts through skin, muscle, and sinew in a few swift, sawing motions. The patient's shrieks are inhuman. Then comes the saw. The sound of its teeth grating on bone is a sound that, once heard, is never forgotten. Finally, the severed limb is cast aside and the surgeon takes the glowing, cauterizing iron from the fire and presses it against the stump. The hiss of sizzling flesh and the smell of burning meat fills the air. This horrifying act of cauterization, burning the wound shut, was the only known way to stop the bleeding. If the patient survived the shock and the blood loss of the procedure itself, they then faced the almost certain ordeal of infection, which medieval surgeons called laudable pus, believing it to be a necessary part of the healing process. Trepanation, the act of drilling a hole in the skull, was another surprisingly common procedure. It was an ancient practice, dating back to the Stone Age, and was performed for a variety of reasons: to treat skull fractures, to relieve pressure on the brain, or, most often, to release evil spirits or humours believed to be causing epilepsy, migraines, or madness. A surgeon would use a tool called a trephine, essentially a hand-cranked drill with a cylindrical saw blade, to bore through the bone of the conscious patient's skull. The small disc of bone that was removed was often kept by the patient as a lucky charm, a testament to their survival. The removal of bladder stones was another excruciating specialty. Lithotomy was one of the few operations that traveling specialists would perform, jealously guarding their techniques. The surgeon would insert 2 fingers into the patient's rectum to push the bladder stone down, then make a deep incision in the perineum, the area between the anus and the genitals, and attempt to extract the stone with a hook. Without anesthesia, and with a high risk of hemorrhage and infection, the mortality rate was staggering. Yet the pain of the condition was so great that people willingly submitted themselves to this butchery. Was there no escape from this agony? Was there no concept of pain relief? There were attempts, but they were a desperate gamble, a medical game of Russian roulette. The most famous anesthetic of the era was the soporific sponge, or spongia somnifera. A sea sponge would be soaked in a potent cocktail of narcotic and poisonous herbs, typically opium, mandrake, henbane, and hemlock. The dried sponge would then be reconstituted with hot water and held over the patient's nose and mouth. If the dosage was right, the patient would fall into a deep stupor, a state of unconsciousness that allowed the surgeon to work. But the line between anesthesia and a fatal overdose was vanishingly thin. The concentration of active alkaloids in the plants was highly variable. A dose that merely sedated one patient could easily stop another's heart forever. For this reason, many surgeons refused to use them, preferring to operate on a screaming, conscious patient than a silent, potentially dead one. The Church also looked upon such practices with suspicion. Pain, especially the pain of childbirth, was seen as a divinely ordained punishment for original sin. To alleviate it with drugs was to interfere with God's will, a hubris that smacked of witchcraft. The theatre of pain was not a place of healing in the modern sense. It was a place of last resort, a final, desperate throw of the dice against certain death. The medieval surgeon was not a savior in a white coat. He was a tormentor in a bloody apron, a man who had to steel himself against the screams of his fellow human beings to perform his gruesome but sometimes necessary work. The will to live of both the patient who endured the unendurable and the surgeon who inflicted it is a testament to the sheer desperation of the age. But the suffering of the body was, in some ways, considered a lesser evil. There was another kind of affliction, a sickness of the mind, that was seen as far more terrifying. For when the mind broke, it was not a matter for the surgeon's saw or the physician's lancet. It was a sign that the soul itself had been taken captive, and the only cure was to wage war against the demon within. In the medieval world, the landscape of the mind was a battlefield, and the prize was the human soul. There was no concept of mental illness as we understand it today. Depression, schizophrenia, epilepsy, bipolar disorder, these were not seen as malfunctions of the brain's chemistry, but as direct evidence of demonic possession. A person suffering from madness was not sick. They were captured territory, a vessel inhabited by a malevolent entity from the pits of hell. Consequently, the doctor for the insane was not a physician, but a priest. The treatment was not therapy, but exorcism. This theological framing of mental illness turned a medical condition into a spiritual crime and condemned its sufferers to a nightmare of torment, justified by the highest authority. The diagnosis of demonic possession was based on a terrifyingly vague set of symptoms. Did a person speak in strange voices? Were they unnaturally strong? Did they blaspheme or show an aversion to holy objects? Did they suffer from convulsions or fits? All were considered telltale signs that a demon had taken up residence in their body. Once the diagnosis was made, the patient was handed over to the exorcist, who would begin the brutal process of driving the entity out. The ritual of exorcism was a systematic assault on the host body. The theory was that if the body could be made sufficiently inhospitable, a place of constant pain and misery, the demon would be forced to leave. The afflicted person would be isolated, often chained to a wall in a dark cellar or a church crypt. They would be starved, deprived of sleep, and subjected to constant prayer and interrogation. The exorcist, believing he was at war with a supernatural foe, showed no mercy to the flesh that harbored it. The patient would be beaten with rods, doused in freezing holy water, and forced to ingest foul-tasting concoctions of herbs, holy oils, and sometimes even urine or excrement. The screams of the sufferer were not interpreted as cries of pain, but as the voice of the demon resisting its eviction. The more the patient suffered, the more the exorcist was convinced he was winning the battle. This process could go on for weeks, months, even years. If the patient's symptoms subsided, the exorcism was declared a success, a miracle of God's power. If the patient died from the abuse, their death was seen as a tragic but necessary casualty in the war against Satan. The soul, it was reasoned, had been saved even if the body was destroyed. The contrast with the medical practices of the contemporary Arab world is stark and damning. While Europeans were chaining and torturing their mentally ill, great Islamic cities like Baghdad and Cairo had established bimaristans, hospitals that were centuries ahead of their time. These institutions had specialized wards for patients with mental afflictions. They were treated with a remarkable degree of humanity, with therapies that included soothing music, baths, aromatic perfumes, and compassionate counseling. The Islamic physicians, following the teachings of Avicenna, viewed madness as an illness of the brain and sought to treat it with rest and kindness. For those in Europe who were not subjected to exorcism, the fate was often just as grim. The mad were seen as a danger, a nuisance, or at best a source of cruel amusement. They were cast out of their communities to wander as beggars, or they were locked away in the first primitive asylums, which were little more than prisons. London's Bethlehem Hospital, which would become infamous under the nickname Bedlam, was founded in the 13th century. Here, the insane were kept in cages, chained to walls, and their chaotic ravings became a popular public spectacle, with Londoners paying a penny to come and stare at the unfortunate inmates as if they were animals in a zoo. Could you imagine a world where your deepest grief, your most profound anxiety, could be diagnosed as a hostile takeover of your soul? Where the only help offered was a ritual designed to break your body and spirit? The hunt for the possessed was a true psychological thriller where the victim could never prove their own sanity. Any protest, any rational argument could be twisted and reinterpreted as the cunning deception of the demon within. This brutal intersection of faith and medicine created a hell on earth for those whose minds had already betrayed them. It was a system that offered no hope, no comfort, and no cure. It was a reflection of a worldview that saw the human being as a fallen, corrupt creature, a constant battleground between the forces of heaven and hell. But even as the exorcists waged their war on the phantoms of the mind, another, quieter revolution was beginning. It was taking place in shadowy cellars and secret laboratories conducted by men who were themselves walking a fine line between science and heresy. They were not looking for demons or angels. They were searching for the very essence of matter, for the secrets of transformation. They were the alchemists, and their obsessive quest for gold and immortality would unexpectedly lead them to create a new, aggressive, and lethally potent form of medicine, one that sought to heal the body not with herbs, but with poison. In the shadowy borderlands between science, magic, and religion, the alchemist toiled in secret. His laboratory was a chaotic sanctuary, a world away from the sterile order of the monastery and the bloody theatre of the barber surgeon. It was a place of arcane symbols, of bubbling alembics and glowing furnaces, the air thick with the acrid smell of sulphur and mercury. The alchemist's quest was twofold and epic in its ambition. He sought the philosopher's stone, a mythical substance that could transmute base metals like lead into pure gold, and the elixir of life, a potion that would grant eternal youth and cure all diseases. While these goals seem like pure fantasy to the modern mind, the alchemists were the true pioneers of experimental chemistry. In their relentless, often misguided pursuit of transmutation, they discovered and purified new elements, invented laboratory equipment like the still and the retort, and developed techniques of distillation, sublimation, and crystallization that laid the foundations for modern chemistry. But it was their search for the elixir of life that would have the most direct and dangerous impact on the practice of medicine. The traditional medicine of Galen, with its gentle herbs and focus on balancing humors, was beginning to seem passive and ineffective, especially after its colossal failure during the Black Death. A new generation of medical thinkers began to wonder, what if disease was not just an imbalance, but an invader? What if it required not a gentle rebalancing, but a powerful, aggressive counterattack? This revolutionary idea found its most famous and belligerent champion in a Swiss physician and alchemist named Paracelsus. A controversial and arrogant genius, Paracelsus publicly burned the books of Galen and Avicenna, declaring that a new era of medicine had begun. He argued that the human body was a microcosm, a small-scale version of the universe, and that its functions were fundamentally chemical in nature. Sickness, he claimed, was the result of a specific chemical imbalance that could be corrected by a specific chemical remedy. This was the birth of iatrochemistry, or chemical medicine. Paracelsus's most enduring contribution was his radical re-envisioning of poison. He famously declared, "All things are poison, and nothing is without poison. The dosage alone makes it so, a thing is not a poison." In this single phrase, he swept away the old herbal distinction between healing plants and deadly ones. He argued that the most potent poisons, minerals like mercury, arsenic, antimony, and lead, were also the most powerful medicines if they could be properly purified. and administered in minute doses. He believed these toxic metals could be alchemically tamed, their poisonous nature transmuted into a healing power that would target and destroy disease with a speed and ferocity that no herbal remedy could match. This was a thrilling, terrifying new frontier. Iatrochemists began creating the first chemical drugs. They used mercury to treat syphilis, a horrifying new disease that was ravaging Europe. The mercury did indeed kill the syphilis spirochete, but it also slowly, systematically poisoned the patient, causing neurological damage, kidney failure, and a gruesome condition where the teeth would loosen and fall out. They created antimony cups, goblets made from the toxic metalloid. Wine left to stand in the cup overnight would absorb traces of the antimony, turning it into a brutally effective emetic. Patients would drink from the cup and vomit so violently that it was seen as a miraculous purging of their disease. The cup could be used again and again, passed down through a family for generations. Arsenic, the classic assassin's poison, was prescribed in small doses as a tonic, a strengthening medicine. These new chemical remedies produced dramatic, immediate effects. Unlike gentle herbal infusions, the poisons worked with a shocking swiftness. The violent purging caused by an antimony potion or the profuse salivation brought on by mercury felt like powerful medicine. To a public desperate for cures, these tangible, aggressive reactions seemed like proof of their efficacy. A war erupted within the medical community. The traditional Galenist physicians, with their reliance on ancient texts and humoral theory, were horrified. They saw the iatrochemists as reckless charlatans, as poisoners masquerading as healers. The iatrochemists, in turn, mocked the Galenists as timid, ignorant old fools, blindly clinging to outdated dogmas while their patients died. The debate was not merely academic, it was a vicious struggle for legitimacy and for the lucrative patronage of the rich and powerful. The alchemical laboratory, once a place of esoteric spiritual quests, had become a pharmaceutical weapons factory. The search for the elixir of life had not led to immortality, but to the creation of a double-edged sword, medicines that could, in some cases, suppress the symptoms of a disease, but at the cost of slowly destroying the body they were meant to heal. It was the age-old temptation for a quick fix, a magic bullet, a promise that modern medicine still grapples with today. What would you choose, a slow, uncertain path to health, or a fast, powerful, and potentially deadly cure? This clash between the old and the new, between the plant and the mineral, the tradition and the poison, marked a profound turning point. Medicine was becoming more aggressive, more interventionist, and in many ways more dangerous. But even as this internal war raged within European medicine, a far greater conflict was brewing on the world stage. The armies of Christendom were on the move, marching east to reclaim the Holy Land. And in the bloody crucible of the Crusades, the primitive, dogmatic medicine of Europe would come face to face with a medical tradition so advanced, so sophisticated, and so humane that it would expose the full, shocking extent of its own ignorance. You're gravely ill, and two doctors offer a cure. The old Galenist offers a complex herbal tea that will take weeks to work, if it works at all. The young Paracelsian offers a single, shimmering pill of distilled minerals that promises a swift, violent purge of your illness tonight. Your life is on the line. Which risk do you take? Comment with your choice, the gentle herb or the potent poison. The year is 1100. A Crusader knight lies wounded in a field hospital outside Jerusalem, his leg shattered by a mace. A thick, dark infection has set in, and the stench of gangrene fills the tent. His European surgeon, a man trained in the bloody arts of the battlefield, offers the only cure he knows. He calls for a sharpened axe to amputate the limb and a brazier of hot coals to cauterize the stump. The knight, pale with fear and fever, commends his soul to God. But before the grim procedure can begin, an Arab physician, a captive serving the Crusader army, intercedes. He gently cleans the wound not with fire, but with wine, a natural antiseptic. He carefully removes the dead tissue with a delicate scalpel, stitches the flesh together with a fine needle, and applies a dressing soaked in a soothing, fragrant balm. The European surgeon looks on with a mixture of contempt and disbelief, declaring such methods to be useless sorcery. This scene, recounted in the chronicles of the era, is a stark illustration of the vast, almost unbelievable chasm that separated the medical worlds of Christian Europe and the Islamic caliphates during the High Middle Ages. The Crusades were not just a holy war fought for control of sacred sites, they were a violent, head-on collision between two civilizations, and nowhere was the contrast between them more pronounced than on the field of medicine. The Crusaders who marched to the Holy Land brought their medicine with them, a brutal cocktail of prayer, bleeding and cauterization, all filtered through the dogmatic lens of humoral theory. They were confident in the superiority of their ways, products of a culture that saw itself as the sole inheritor of truth. What they encountered in the cities of the Levant must have been a profound shock. They found a medical tradition that had not only preserved the great works of the Greek and Roman physicians, but had built upon them, creating a system of healthcare that was, by any measure, centuries ahead of their own. While European medicine had stagnated in monasteries, Islamic scholars had embarked on a massive project of translation, absorbing and synthesizing medical knowledge from Greece, Persia, and India. Figures like Al-Razi, Rhazes, and Ibn Sina, Avicenna, were not merely commentators on Galen, they were brilliant clinicians and experimentalists in their own right. Avicenna's encyclopedic Canon of Medicine was a monumental work that systematically organized all known medical knowledge. It was so comprehensive and authoritative that once translated into Latin, it would become a standard medical textbook in European universities for the next 600 years. The most visible symbol of this superiority was the Bimaristan, the Islamic hospital. While the infirmaries of Europe were little more than hospices, places for the poor to die with a measure of spiritual comfort, the Bimaristans of Cairo, Damascus, and Baghdad were secular, state-funded institutions dedicated to the scientific treatment of disease. They were marvels of organization and public health. They had separate wards for men and women, and for different categories of illness: internal medicine, surgery, ophthalmology, and mental disorders. There were outpatient clinics, pharmacies dispensing free medicines, and vast medical libraries. Patients were treated by professional salaried physicians, their care was free, and their bedding was clean. Music was often played in the wards, and fountains provided a soothing sound and cool air, all part of a holistic approach to healing. For a European accustomed to the filth and despair of a monastic infirmary, a Bimaristan must have seemed like a palace of miracles. The Arab physicians had mastered techniques that were either unknown or viewed as heresy in the West. They understood the contagious nature of diseases like tuberculosis, advocating for quarantine. They had developed a vast pharmacopoeia of drugs, including anesthetics derived from cannabis and opium, which allowed them to perform complex and delicate surgeries. Their surgeons could remove cataracts, a procedure that would not be successfully replicated in Europe for centuries. They treated wounds with a combination of cleanliness, antiseptics, and sutures, resulting in healing rates that seemed miraculous to the Crusaders, whose own wounded almost invariably succumbed to infection. The European reaction to this advanced medicine was a confused mixture of suspicion, arrogance, and grudging admiration. Chroniclers of the Crusades tell stories that reveal their profound medical ignorance. One famous account describes a Frankish knight who insisted his surgeon treat a woman with a headache by cutting her scalp in the shape of a cross and rubbing it with salt. When an abscess on a man's leg was being successfully treated with poultices by an Arab physician, the knight intervened, asked if the man preferred to live with one leg or die with two, and promptly had the leg hacked off with an axe. The man died instantly. The Arab physician, observing this, was said to have remarked, "I have learned more about medicine in these few moments than I have in my entire life." Yet despite this official hostility and cultural arrogance, knowledge began to seep through the cracks. Crusader lords, when they fell ill, would often secretly consult Arab physicians rather than trust their lives to their own barbaric surgeons. Scholars in Spain and Sicily, at the frontier between the Christian and Islamic worlds, began the slow, laborious process of translating the great Arabic medical texts into Latin. This trickle of knowledge would eventually become a flood, sparking a revolution in European thought. The Crusaders may have ultimately failed in their military quest to permanently secure the Holy Land, but they returned to Europe with more than just relics and riches. They brought back a terrifying, humbling realization that their entire system of medicine was a primitive, blood-soaked superstition compared to the sophisticated science of the infidels they had sought to conquer. This stolen knowledge, however, would create a new battleground back home, not on the battlefield, but in the halls of the newly emerging universities, where a new kind of doctor was being forged, a doctor who would wield his bookish Latin as a weapon against his greatest rival, the woman who delivered the children. As the High Middle Ages gave way to an era of burgeoning cities and intellectual ferment, a new institution rose to challenge the monastery's dominance over knowledge, the university. In Salerno, Bologna, Montpellier, and Paris, the first medical faculties were established, creating a new, elite caste of physicians. These were not the humble monk healers of the Dark Ages, nor the rough and ready barber surgeons of the marketplace. These were academics, men of letters who spent years studying the newly translated texts of Galen, Hippocrates, and Avicenna. Their knowledge was theoretical, book-based, and conducted entirely in Latin, the universal language of scholarship, which conveniently excluded the vast majority of the population from its secrets. The university physician was a master of logic and disputation. He could debate the finer points of humoral theory for hours, quoting from the ancient authorities with flawless recall. His practice was one of diagnosis and prescription, a purely intellectual exercise. He would stand at a safe distance from the patient's bed, solemnly inspect a flask of urine, the primary diagnostic tool of the age, and, based on its color, scent, and turbidity, pronounce a complex diagnosis rooted in Galenic theory. He was, in essence, a medical philosopher, and his authority was derived not from practical experience, but from his mastery of a sacred, inaccessible body of texts. While this new class of male professionals was building its intellectual fortress in the universities, the entire sphere of practical, hands-on healthcare, especially for women, remained firmly in female hands. For centuries, the arts of childbirth, infant care, and domestic healing had been the exclusive domain of midwives, herbalists, and wise women. Their knowledge was not learned from Latin texts, but was passed down through generations, a rich oral tradition of practical skills and botanical wisdom. A skilled midwife was a respected and essential member of her community. She knew how to turn a breech baby, how to manage a difficult labor, and how to use herbal remedies to ease pain and prevent hemorrhage. She was a counselor, a pharmacist, and a surgeon all in one, presiding over the most dangerous and fundamental of all human experiences, birth. This created an inevitable conflict. The university-trained physicians, in their quest to professionalize and monopolize medicine, saw these female practitioners as their primary rivals. The midwives represented a form of knowledge that was unregulated, untaxed, unwritten, and, most threateningly, effective. They controlled a vast and lucrative area of healthcare from which the male physicians were almost entirely excluded. A war for control was inevitable. The campaign to discredit and eliminate female healers was systematic and ruthless. First, they were attacked as ignorant. The physicians argued that since midwives could not read Latin or quote Galen, their knowledge was mere superstition, their practice a dangerous game of chance. They were portrayed as dirty, gossiping old crones, a stark contrast to the sober, learned male academic. But the charge of ignorance was not enough. To truly destroy their authority, they had to be painted not just as incompetent, but as malevolent. The connection between female healing and witchcraft, which had long simmered in theological discourse, was now weaponized by the emerging medical establishment. The midwife, with her secret knowledge of herbs, some of which could induce abortion, and her presence at the mysterious, bloody, and exclusively female ritual of childbirth, became an easy target for suspicion. Her work was with life and death, the very forces that seemed to touch upon the supernatural. If a baby was stillborn or deformed, it was tragically easy to blame the midwife's curse rather than the unpredictability of nature. The publication of the infamous Malleus Maleficarum, or the hammer of witches, in the late 15th century provided the ultimate tool for this medical witch hunt. The book explicitly states that midwives are more likely than any other women to be witches, using their skills to offer newborn infants to demons or to cause impotence in men. Imagine a public trial. On one side stands a university physician dressed in his academic robes, speaking in complex, authoritative Latin. On the other stands a local midwife, a woman who has safely delivered hundreds of babies. The physician accuses her of using a diabolical charm to ease a woman's labor pains, thus cheating God of his rightful punishment for Eve's sin. The midwife's protests, her appeals to common sense and long experience, are dismissed as the cunning lies of a witch. The court, composed entirely of men who have never witnessed a birth, listens to the physician's expert testimony and condemns her to the flames. This was not just a battle over ideas, it was an economic and gender war. By eliminating the midwife, the male physician could seize control over the lucrative field of obstetrics. The tragic irony is that this professionalization often led to a catastrophic decline in outcomes for mothers and infants. The first male accoucheurs, or obstetricians, were often clumsy and ignorant, their book learning no substitute for the practical wisdom of the women they had replaced. They brought the filth of the sick room and the dissecting lab into the birthing chamber on their unwashed hands, leading to epidemics of childbed fever. They invented brutal instruments like the obstetrical forceps, which, while sometimes life-saving, often caused horrific injuries to both mother and child in their inexperienced hands. The rise of academic medicine, which should have been a step forward, became, for women, a giant leap backward into an era of increased danger and powerlessness. The new temple of science was being built, but its foundations were laid upon the ashes of its female competitors. Yet even within this new, rigid, and deeply flawed academic system, the seeds of a true revolution were being sown. A few brave men were beginning to realize that the sacred texts they had memorized were full of lies, and the only way to find the truth was to open up the one book they had been forbidden to read, the human body itself. For 1,000 years, the science of medicine had been built on a foundation of ghosts and echoes. The authority was Galen, a physician from the 2nd century who, due to Roman religious prohibitions, had based his understanding of human anatomy almost exclusively on the dissection of pigs and Barbary apes. For a millennium, physicians and surgeons had operated on human beings using a roadmap drawn from the insides of an animal. They believed the human liver had 5 lobes, like a pig's. They believed the human jaw was 2 separate bones, like a monkey's. They believed in a mythical network of holes in the septum of the heart, the invisible pores, through which blood was thought to pass from one side to the other. To question these facts was to question the very pillar of medical knowledge, an act of supreme academic heresy. The primary reason for this long night of ignorance was another powerful prohibition, this one from the Church. The dissection of a human corpse was seen as an act of desecration, a mutilation of the temple of the Holy Spirit that awaited resurrection on Judgment Day. This theological ban was the single greatest obstacle to medical progress. It ensured that medicine remained a speculative philosophy rather than an observational science. But by the late Middle Ages and the dawn of the Renaissance, the thirst for true, verifiable knowledge was becoming too powerful to be contained by dogma. In the universities of Italy, a handful of daring anatomists began to defy the taboo. The first dissections were clandestine, dangerous affairs. They were conducted in secret, often at night, by the flickering light of candles. The bodies were those of executed criminals, stolen from the gallows under the cover of darkness by students sworn to secrecy. Imagine the scene. A cold stone chamber, the air thick with the smell of formaldehyde and fear. A small group of men huddle around a wooden table upon which lies a corpse. The professor, a man like Mondino de Liuzzi of Bologna, one of the first to perform a public dissection in centuries, makes the first cautious incision. For the students gathered around, this is a moment of profound revelation and terror. They are violating one of society's deepest prohibitions, risking excommunication and accusations of heresy. but they are also seeing, for the very first time, the reality of the human interior. They are seeing that the liver has only two main lobes. They are seeing that the jaw is a single bone. They are staring at the solid, muscular wall of the cardiac septum and realizing that Galen's invisible pores simply do not exist. Each cut of the anatomist's knife was a slash through the fabric of ancient authority. Every organ, every muscle, every bone they exposed was a piece of evidence in a trial against 1,000 years of accepted error. The anatomists were not just exploring a body, they were dismantling a worldview. This was a revolution that began not with a bang, but with the quiet, wet sound of a scalpel parting flesh. The church's resistance was fierce. The practice was condemned as ghoulish and sacrilegious. Anatomists were constantly under threat of investigation, their work driven underground. But the knowledge they were uncovering was too important to be suppressed. The development of the printing press in the mid-15th century allowed their findings to spread with unprecedented speed. Anatomical atlases filled with detailed, realistic illustrations based on actual human dissections began to circulate among Europe's medical schools. The work of artists like Leonardo da Vinci, who conducted his own secret dissections to better understand the human form, merged the worlds of art and science, revealing the terrifying, intricate beauty of the body's inner machinery. The ghost of Galen, who had ruled medicine unopposed for 13 centuries, was finally being confronted with evidence he could not refute. But the old world would not yield easily. For generations, professors of medicine would continue to lecture from the texts of Galen, even while a dissected human body lay on the table before them, contradicting his every word. When a discrepancy was found, the common practice was to conclude not that Galen was wrong, but that the human body must have changed since the 2nd century. Such was the power of dogma. The story of medieval medicine, therefore, does not end with a triumphant breakthrough. It ends instead on the cusp of a long and bloody war. It is a war between the book and the body, between ancient authority and direct observation. The night is beginning to recede, but the dawn is still a long way off. Medicine is still cruel, still largely ineffective. Patients are still being bled, purged and poisoned in the name of a flawed theory. But for the first time in 1,000 years, a new path has been opened. It is a path that leads not to the library, but to the dissecting table. It is a path that will be paved with the bodies of the dead, and it will require centuries of painful, painstaking work to follow. The first anatomists, these grave-robbing pioneers, did not give us the answers. But they gave us something far more important: the courage to ask the right questions and the knowledge that the truth of the human body could not be found in the whispers of ancient ghosts, but must be sought with a steady hand, a sharp eye, and a cold steel blade in the silent, magnificent, and final mystery of the flesh itself.